The mother, who's a flamboyant California biker with an affinity for who bravely raises her little son Rocky, a little boy with a rare disease that eventually distorts his face into a cruel mask of deformity.
Before she died, Rocky Dennis's mom finally broke silence about Rocky Dennis, and it's bad. There's a woman who watched her son die exactly the way she promised him he would, at home, in his own bed, without a single machine keeping him alive. And decades later, before she herself passed away, she sat for interviews and said things about that promise, about her parenting, and about the movie that made her famous, that most people who cried through Mask in 1985 never actually heard. This is the story of Rusty Dennis, the real woman behind Cher's Oscar-nominated performance, and what she admitted once the cameras stopped rolling and Hollywood was no longer writing her lines for her. Most people know the outline. A boy born with a severe facial deformity. A tough, leather jacket-wearing biker mother who refused to let the world pity him. A tear-jerking film that turned their story into a piece of American pop culture. What most people do not know is what came after the credits rolled. The years of interviews where Rusty Dennis, in her own blunt and unfiltered way, corrected the record, praised the film, criticized the film, and revealed a version of motherhood far messier and far more human than anything a 2-hour movie could hold. To understand what she eventually said, you first have to understand what she actually lived. Her son, born Roy Lee Dennis in the early 1960s, picked up the nickname Rocky as an infant because he would only settle down when he was rocked. As a toddler, he suffered from constant ear and sinus infections, the kind of thing that worries a parent but rarely terrifies one. Then came a routine procedure, and a technician who noticed something unusual in an X-ray of his skull. What followed was nearly a year of appointments and tests at a major medical center before doctors finally had a name for what was happening to him. A rare bone disorder that causes calcium to build up abnormally in the skull, thickening it, distorting the face, and slowly crushing the nerves that control sight, hearing, and other basic functions. At the time, doctors told his mother the disease had been documented only a handful of times anywhere in medical history. They also told her, flatly, what to expect: blindness, likely cognitive impairment, and death, probably before the age of 7. That prognosis is the hinge on which this entire story turns, because Rusty Dennis simply refused to accept it as a script she had to follow. Instead of preparing for loss, she prepared for a fight. She pushed teachers who assumed her son couldn't keep up academically. She confronted doctors who assumed his poor eyesight meant he shouldn't bother learning to read. She insisted over and over that the resistance she encountered had nothing to do with her son's actual abilities and everything to do with how uncomfortable other people were with his face. And by most accounts, she was right. Teachers and classmates who got to know him consistently described a kid who was funny, sharp, and remarkably good at making other people comfortable with him, even when they arrived nervous or afraid. But before we get into what she said decades later, it's worth understanding who this woman actually was, because the polished, glamorous version audiences saw in theaters was, by her own admission, a simplified one. She was born in Brooklyn in the mid-1930s, the daughter of a truck driver, raised Jewish and sharp-tongued in a working-class New York household. By her early teens, she was already clashing with school authorities, and by 15 she had dropped out entirely, taking work as a dancer at Coney Island before she was even old enough to legally drive. She married young, had her first son from that marriage, watched it fall apart, and eventually remarried and moved to California, where Rocky was born. By the time doctors delivered their devastating diagnosis, Rusty had already built her worldview around one central, almost stubborn belief, that if a person could think themselves sick, they could just as easily think themselves well. She raised her son inside that philosophy completely. When headaches struck, and for a child with his condition, they struck constantly and brutally, she would send him to his room and tell him to concentrate on getting better. It is impossible to separate how much of Rocky's resilience came from that mindset and how much pain may have gone unspoken because of it. That tension between empowering a child and possibly minimizing his suffering is one of the most honest and uncomfortable threads running through everything Rusty said in later interviews. She never apologized for the approach. She never once suggested she'd have done it differently. The film softened plenty about her life, But one detail it kept mostly intact was the world she and her son lived in. A tight-knit, rough-edged motorcycle club that treated Rocky less like a fragile kid to be protected and more like a beloved member of the family. These were not casual weekend riders. They were hard-living people bound by loyalty, and by every account, they adored him completely. The film's gruff, gentle biker character who serves as a father figure was based directly on Rusty's real-life partner, and the tight community surrounding them wasn't set dressing invented for the screen. It was simply their actual life, transplanted mostly intact. Where Rusty pushed back hardest, though, was on how the film explained her drug use. On screen, her struggles are framed sympathetically, almost as an understandable response to the exhausting weight of raising a dying child alone. In real interviews, she rejected that framing outright. She didn't describe herself as a woman drowning in grief who turned to substances to cope. She described herself as someone who partied constantly because that was simply the lifestyle she belonged to, full stop, no tragic backstory required. It's a small distinction on paper, but it says a lot about who she was. She wanted credit for surviving her circumstances, not pity for being broken by them. Now here's where things get genuinely uncomfortable, and where the silence she eventually broke actually starts to matter. When the film hit theaters in 1985, it became a massive box office success, earning tens of millions of dollars, launching an award-nominated performance, and cementing itself as one of the defining tear-jerkers of the decade. Rusty, meanwhile, had sold the rights to her family's story for a comparatively tiny sum. And most of that money, according to her own later interviews, didn't go toward anything glamorous. It went to medical bills, not for Rocky, but for her older son from her first marriage, who was battling a serious illness of his own at the very same time the film was being made. That fact alone reframes everything. She wasn't cashing in on her dead son's story for profit. She was using it to try to keep her other son alive. And when reporters showed up expecting a grateful, tearful mother basking in Hollywood spotlight, what they got instead was someone far more clear-eyed and, frankly, more critical than anyone anticipated. She openly called the film a kind of fairy tale, not a slight against its quality, but an acknowledgement that it wasn't quite the story she thought she was selling. She had expected a movie about her son's courage. What she got was a film that split its attention, turning her into a glamorous, complicated central character in her own right, something she admitted she never fully expected or asked for. On the actress who portrayed her, though, she was surprisingly generous. She said the performance captured her personality accurately, and she seemed almost amused rather than offended by how larger-than-life the portrayal made her look. Where her frustration surfaced more clearly was in the factual gaps. She pointed out that the film compressed well over a decade of real events into what looks like roughly a single year on screen. And she pointed out something far more personal and far more painful. Her older son, the one whose medical bills that tiny payday had actually helped cover, was left out of the film entirely. He simply didn't exist in the version of the story Hollywood chose to tell. Then there was the argument over music, which might sound trivial until you understand how much it meant to her son. Rocky had been a devoted fan of a particular rock artist, and the director had built much of the film's emotional tone around that artist's songs. But a licensing dispute meant the studio quietly swapped the soundtrack for a different artist's music without informing the director. And Rusty made her feelings about that switch unmistakably clear, saying essentially that her son wouldn't have even recognized the substituted artist. It was a small, sharp comment, but it triggered a much larger fight. The director was furious enough to sue the studio over creative control, and it would take roughly 2 decades before a restored version of the film brought the original intended music back. All of that, though, is really just the noise around the story. The part that hits differently is what happened the night her son actually died. By the final weeks of his life, the disease that doctors once swore would kill him before he turned 7 had finally caught up with him at 16. He was using a wheelchair. The headaches that had shadowed him his entire life had become unbearable. On what would be his last night, the family went out to dinner as they often did, and everyone around the table could see how much weaker he had become. When they got home, he complained of a headache, and his mother did exactly what she had done every single time for his entire life. She sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. He never woke up. The version of that night audiences saw in theaters shows the mother discovering her son's body herself, a devastating and intimate scene. The real version is quieter and, in its own way, sadder. She wasn't even home when it happened. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with an unrelated legal matter, and it was her partner who found him and called to tell her. That gap between the movie and reality doesn't make her a worse mother. If anything, it reveals just how much Hollywood smoothed over an already jagged, complicated true story to make it fit neatly into a 2-hour runtime. And here's the part that deserves to be said honestly, without putting words in her mouth that she never actually said herself. Rusty never publicly framed her "make yourself well" philosophy as a mistake. She never described it with guilt, and she never walked it back, not in any interview on record. What she did say, consistently, was that she believed in it completely, right up until the end. Whether that mindset sometimes meant her son's pain went unacknowledged is something only the two of them could ever really know. What we do know is that she never disowned the philosophy, and she never stopped believing it had given her son something rare, the ability to live without ever fully seeing himself as a dying child. To really understand her, though, you have to understand the son the movie erased entirely. Her older son was a writer living in San Francisco when, not long after the film's release, he was diagnosed with an illness tied to the AIDS crisis that was devastating communities across the country at the time. He was openly gay, and by her own account, she supported him fully, even as she quietly hoped, in her own way, for grandchildren someday. He died a couple of years after his brother's story hit theaters, still in his early 30s. By then, Rusty had lost both of her sons, and the tiny payday from selling her family story, the one that seemed almost insultingly small compared to the film's box office success, had gone toward trying to buy her older son more time. She sold one son's story to try to save the other one's life. When you understand that, her prickliness with reporters, her refusal to play the grateful, grieving Hollywood mother, makes a lot more sense. After her younger son's death, she didn't fade into a quiet, tragic retirement. She moved to San Francisco, took up meditation practices, and began working as a counselor helping people struggling with addiction. She had plans, around the time the film came out, to work directly with terminally ill patients, including many affected by the same epidemic that had taken her older son. The chaotic, unconventional woman audiences met on screen was, by the mid-1980s, quietly building something steadier, even as she kept riding motorcycles right up until the end of her life. That end came in a way that felt almost fittingly dramatic for a woman who had never lived quietly. Riding her 3-wheeled motorcycle one afternoon in her 70s, a tire came loose, sending her into a curb and then into a telephone pole. What makes it especially haunting is that for a period afterward, almost no one close to her knew what had happened. It took a small newspaper item about an unidentified elderly woman injured in a crash for friends and family to piece together that it was her. She survived the initial impact with 2 broken legs and a punctured lung, because of course she did, but an infection that followed proved impossible to fight off. She died in a hospital in November of 2006 at 70 years old. Even at the very end, she never stopped being exactly who she had always been. She described her son's death not as a tragedy to dwell on, but as him simply moving on to another place, since he'd always loved going new places. She said more than once that death simply wasn't something she or her older son believed in, not in any conventional sense. She never once publicly asked why any of this happened to her family. Not about her younger son. Not about her older son. Not about herself. So what do we actually make of all this? Once you strip away the Hollywood gloss and look only at what's documented and confirmed. Her younger son lived nearly 17 years with a disease that was supposed to kill him before he turned 7. He did it with humor, warmth, and a stubborn refusal to define himself by his appearance. He caught up academically after starting behind, made close friends, held part-time jobs tutoring classmates, and reportedly turned down an opportunity for corrective surgery, asking who he would even see in the mirror if his face were changed. He chose to keep his own face. His mother, meanwhile, was a Brooklyn-born former dancer with a drug habit, a troubled school record, and an unshakable belief that the world around her was more broken than her disabled son ever was. In a lot of ways, the record backs her up. She fought school administrators who tried to sideline him. She challenged doctors who tried to reduce him to a diagnosis and a timeline. She surrounded him with a found family of loyal, rough-around-the-edges people who loved him without conditions attached. And yes, on the very last night of his life, she told him, just as she always had, to go to his room and make himself well. He had spent his entire short life trying to do exactly that. The woman who wrote the screenplay that turned this family into a household story once said something that captures the whole complicated truth better than almost anything else on record. That Rusty Dennis was never going to be anyone's idea of a model mother. But she was, without question, the exact mother her son actually needed. Whether you hear that as praise, as criticism, or as both at once, is really up to you. The facts don't ask for your approval. They just are what they are. Her son died at home, in his sleep, without hospital machinery, without indignity, exactly the way she had always promised him he would. She kept that promise. And when her own turn came decades later, she went out the same way she had lived, in motion, on her own terms, still riding, right up until she simply couldn't anymore. If you were expecting a neat, tidy ending here, some perfect moment of redemption wrapped up in a bow, that was never going to happen with a woman like this. What she left behind instead was something harder to sit with and far more honest. The real story, exactly as messy and complicated as it actually was, finally told without a studio filter standing in the way. If this gave you a completely different picture of a story you thought you already knew, let us know in the comments. And subscribe for more deep dives into the real people and real history hiding behind Hollywood's most famous tearjerkers.